Thanks, Chris. I'm Hayley Fowler. Again, I'd like to thank Linda for inviting me yet again to come and help out and chair one of these incredibly interesting summer schools here at NCAR. We did a similar thing 2 years ago. I think we've learned from that, and hopefully this colloquium this year will be even better. I'm actually at Newcastle University in the UK, and I'm still a little bit jet lagged, but probably not as jet lagged as some of you in the audience. And today I really want to talk about impacts and uncertainty. That's my particular specialism. So I thought I'd start, like everyone else, talking about who I am. I was just thinking about this or mulling this over while I was sat in the audience just now. And I guess I always wanted to be a mathematician, actually, when I was younger. And it wasn't until, I guess, my teens that I decided that actually it was a little bit too abstract mathematics for me. And I've always been interested in how things work and processes. And it was a bit of a toss-up, really, between becoming an engineer or becoming a geographer, in terms of, do I want to understand natural processes or engineered processes? So I decided to go down the route. I was a bit inspired by one of my geography teachers at school, and went down the route of doing geography at Cambridge University as an undergrad. But I then decided that actually, although it was really interesting to understand how things work, it wasn't actually very useful in terms of trying to come up with solutions for some of society's problems. And I wanted to do something a little bit more applied. So I went up to Newcastle University, and I've been there a really long time now, since 1996, when I started a master's in water resource systems engineering, and then stayed on to do a PhD in civil engineering. And in fact, in that PhD, looked at the impact of climate change on water resource systems. And I'm now a professor of climate change impacts at Newcastle. So my take on this, or my sort of thought process through my research, really has been starting with this idea of climate change impacts on water resources, and then really seeing the need to understand downscaling methods more. And by that I mean producing information from climate models like Chris has just introduced, and producing information necessary to look at impacts at very small scales. Looking at impacts modelling itself needed an interdisciplinary approach. And I'm particularly interested in practical applications and solutions to societal issues, and particularly extremes. And my research really looks at heavy rainfall, droughts and floods, impacts on water resources. And recently I've realised actually that we need to think about using climate models in a very different way. And a lot of my recent research has been thinking about how can we take information from climate models and use it more usefully within impact studies. And one of those papers was just published in Nature Climate Change a few weeks ago in terms of using very high resolution models. Within my personal life as well, I do things that a lot of people would consider extreme. And I was thinking about this as well. I think that one of the things about defining extremes is that you don't experience them very often. And that's how we define extremes. But actually, I don't define these sort of things here that you see me doing as extreme, because I do them all the time, or you certainly used to do them all the time. And I still define myself as a climber, although I don't do it as much anymore. A biker, lover of mountains, and I now have two small boys, Evan and Callum, who you'll probably meet this evening, and you'll certainly be able to hear them if you don't see them. I thought I'd put up a very pretty picture. This is Toclarahu in Peru, which is over 6,000 meters, which me and my husband climbed in August 2006. And one of the things here is I've got a bit of a vested interest in understanding the impacts of climate change. You can see here, this type of snow cover and glaciers, one of the things that we're perhaps most certain about is that these type of things are reducing, as Chris has already shown, with climate change. And that was then. This is now. I'm doing less extreme things nowadays, but I'm teaching my children to be extreme. So, moving on to what I'm supposed to be talking about today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about impacts, and I thought I'd start by talking about some impacts in the US, since that's where we are. And I actually did the same thing 2 years ago, and there was a very severe drought 2 years ago. And actually there's another one this year, although it's not situated in exactly the same place. You can see here, this is the US Drought Monitor. This is the latest output from them. They do a couple of months, from July the 15th, 2014. And you can see that 34% of the US is actually in moderate to exceptional drought, which is quite a lot. And particularly about 12% is in either extreme or exceptional drought. And you'll see in particular California there on the west coast, which is really severely affected at the moment and has been for a few years now. It's just a kind of escalating situation there. And of course, the whole situation with impacts is very complex. And the problem is that we can't really think of impacts in isolation. So you can see on your right here, the current situation in terms of water resources in California, and the red lines on those boxes. See, does this work very well, Linda? Which one's the laser? The red one. That's really rubbish, isn't it? Gosh. Okay, let me see. No. Okay, so you can see here these red lines here show the historical average at this time of the year for these reservoirs, and you can see that actually many of the reservoirs are really quite empty, talking about sort of 30 to 40% full. So obviously there's problems with water supplies in California at the moment, but there's also downstream effects on things like agriculture as well, obviously, although these are not as big as they thought, because they're doing a lot of they usually use surface water for irrigation, but they're actually doing a lot of pumping of groundwater instead. They're expecting it to cost something like $2.2 billion, the California drought this year, to agriculture. But a lot of that cost is actually coming from this extra pumping of groundwater resources, not from the actual effect on the crops themselves. But that, of course, has a downstream effect on the economy. And interestingly, mitigation as well. If we're thinking about trying to reduce greenhouse gases, this drought actually has a huge impact on California themselves. They wanted to produce a third of their energy through clean energy by 2020, and they're not going to be able to realize that with droughts like this. They produce a lot of their energy through hydropower, and of course, with reservoirs being quite empty, they can't produce hydropower, and also their reliance again on groundwater pumping, of course that's quite energy intensive, for irrigation as well, is all a problem for mitigation. And so you can see this sort of positive feedback loop here, where you're actually producing more emissions and therefore perhaps producing more droughts. And things like wildfires as well have shown large increases in California and other parts as well. I mean, Australia and places like that as well over the last few decades, not only in their number, but also in the length of the season during which they occur. So in the 1970s in California, they really occurred during about 5 months. And now we're talking about a 7-month season. And that's really to do with the fact that obviously snow starts and finishes a lot earlier now. So basically you've got a dry season that lasts a lot longer. And human health as well has, obviously the lack of water has an impact potentially on human health. Obviously the wildfires as well, the smoke from the wildfires have an impact on human health. And also things like smog levels in LA, in terms of rain not clearing out the smog. So you can see here that just taking California as an example, impacts are incredibly complex, and we really need to be thinking about these things in an interdisciplinary way, just thinking about impacts. So what do we know? This is a really neat diagram, I think. I hadn't actually seen it before, but Linda pointed it out to me. It's from Working Group 2 report from the 5th Assessment Report and from the Summary for Policymakers. And you can see all the little tractors and everything on the diagram. It's basically telling us where we have confidence in attributing impacts to climate change. And attribution is an interesting thing. Basically, by attribution, we're saying that we can see a change that's statistically significant in relation to the variability from natural variability, but also that we can come up with a reason, a plausible physical mechanism for this change, and that we've tested that against other plausible physical mechanisms. So you can see here that there's observed impacts attributed to climate change for the blue ones are physical systems, the green ones are biological systems, and the red ones are human and managed systems, and the little tractors are food production, for example. So what's glaringly obvious straight away is what I've already said about things like glaciers, snow and ice. Actually, that's one of the most, if you like, certain, or where we've got most confidence in attribution to climate change of impacts, even in places where there's poor data, in Africa, in Central and South America, for example. The only place we're slightly uncertain about this perhaps is Asia, where there still seems to be the expansion of some large glaciers over there. And also you can see there, for example, places where we do have more data, like Europe and North America, we can also attribute impacts, other impacts, such as, for example, changes in marine ecosystems, changes in terrestrial ecosystems. So have a look at the Working Group 2 report if you're interested in learning more about this. But just to say that we do actually know now, and we can actually attribute quite a lot of the observed changes we've seen in impacts to climate change. So what about the future? This is a paper from Nature Geoscience, and this is actually Western North America precipitation. You can see here this has been declining. This is in terms of looking at California again. It's been declining historically and is projected to decline into the future as well. So we might perhaps expect the impacts in California to continue, and there's good reasons for that. In terms of what we can expect in the future, you can see here this second of the red lines. This is again a table from the Working Group 2, the AR4 fourth assessment report from the IPCC. It's showing what we can expect in the future in terms of impacts on water ecosystems, food, coastal health, and singular events. 2 degrees C is often posited as dangerous climate change, and you can see that actually global temperature change of 2 degrees or rise of 2 degrees relative to 1980 to 1999 might cause, for example, 20 to 30% of species increasingly high risk of extinction. Of course, as you move towards 4 degrees C, which we maybe can expect by the end of this century or something like that, seeing major extinctions around the globe, or expecting that anyway, decreases in agricultural yields, etc., etc. Moving on, and I thought I'd take your diagram here, Rob. This is actually something based on, again, one of Stephen Schneider's uncertainty cascade diagram, but actually with adaptation responses put at the bottom there. You can see here that we have uncertainty at every stage of the process when we're thinking about impacts. So we've got uncertainties in future society, which feed into greenhouse gas emissions, which then feed into climate models, regional scenarios, through to impact models, through to local impacts, and then through to adaptation responses. And this is the way that we've tended to think about uncertainty from the top down. And what we're trying to do really with this colloquium is to turn things around really and think about things more from the decision-making end. Just to say as well, I don't actually like this diagram for many reasons, Rob. I'm sure you don't anymore. Okay. But basically, again, because the uncertainties have very different strengths, or that depending on time scales and on the region you're looking at and the particular impact you're looking at, they can have very different balances. So as you move forward into the future, greenhouse gas emissions might have much stronger uncertainties, for example. But I think it's important that basically we're now starting to think about decision making as a central focus in all our thinking, and basically trying to have a sort of decision making science-led agenda, perhaps, or a decision-making led agenda that provides science that's useful for decision making, which I think is something that hasn't really happened too much in the past. So climate change adaptation requires a clear understanding of the underlying science and methods of assessing impacts through the entire chain, from climate scientists to engineers to decision makers. And I think that, as I've said in the past, decision makers haven't really had enough of an influence on this process. They've basically been told, here is your PDF, a bit like Linda was saying in her talk. Here's the probability distribution, but not being asked actually what is useful for decisions. What do you need? What do you need to know? And that's one of the reasons that I've gone back and thought a little bit more about how we can use climate models in my own research, in terms of how can we make decisions and produce useful information from climate models for impacts. And actually we need to know then about physical mechanisms and societal and economic influences, for example, on these strategies. And I think some of the largest uncertainties in certain parts of the world can come from the human influences actually, rather than the actual physical mechanisms and the climate itself. Impact studies, though, enable us to produce information for adaptation planning and decision making. But it's not a trivial task to actually produce information from climate models. Chris will talk a little bit about this tomorrow, and Linda and myself will talk a little bit more about this on Friday in terms of talking about downscaling, which I've already mentioned. There's lots of different methods out there, but whether we use the right ones is another question entirely. So to give you a little potted history of impact studies, the first real paper talking about climate change impact assessment in a sort of warming world was again by Steve Schneider. And you can see here, this was published in 1981, an editorial. It really talked mainly about agricultural and hydrological impacts at the time. But you can see here, even in 1981, one of the principal developing areas of the interdisciplinary research is climate impact assessment in general. So we knew even 1981 this need for interdisciplinary research. And also we need research strategy and topics through which social science disciplines might help define potential responses to the carbon dioxide problem or the greenhouse gas problem. So it's not a new thing that we need interdisciplinary research, but actually we haven't really included social science as much as we should have done, perhaps in framing questions around the problem of global warming. In terms of impact studies, as I've said already, it started in the early 1980s. There was a concentration on agriculture and hydrological impacts for obvious reasons, really, food production and obviously water resources, and then basically moving into ecological impacts. But actually, recently, the focus has shifted, and we've been including a lot of different things like human health, energy, infrastructure systems as well. And also, we've been thinking about shorter timescales in terms of higher resolution impacts, and also the spatial scale. So, even thinking now about impacts at the scale of cities or sub-regions of cities, and what might happen in terms of perhaps urban flooding or something like that. So that's the type of thing we've moved on to now. There's a lot of uncertainties in impact studies, and certainly 2 years ago, I would have said that and probably still would say that the main uncertainties still come from the climate models driving these impact studies. So these multi-model and perturbed physics ensembles that Chris has already mentioned. But we're now starting to see the first assessments of uncertainties in the impact models themselves. And Katya in the audience here is going to be talking about ICI-MIP tomorrow. And this is another MIP, a model intercomparison project. And ICI-MIP is taking a lot of different impacts models and from agricultural, hydrological, ecological, etc., etc., and comparing the outputs of all of those different models to see whether they're able to reproduce observations. And AgMIP is the agricultural part of that comparison. The problem with all of this, I guess, is that it's still very ad hoc. You can think of it in the same way as a multi-model ensemble from the climate science community. The structures of the models are dissimilar. Some of them contain very different components to others. And indeed, many impacts models are still not truly physically based. They're conceptual models, and they're not based on physics like climate models are. So I would say that most of the uncertainties addressed in impact studies still come from climate modeling. And perhaps if they do come from the impact models, it's because the impact models aren't refined enough, perhaps, yet. So I'm going to finish really by showing what a classical impact study would look like. And you can see at the top there that a classical impact study would take information from a climate model, and it would use some kind of method, which we call a downscaling method, to take that coarse scale resolution information and produce useful information for impacts at the local or regional scale. We then might have multiple numbers of these where we look at different scenarios, basically climate change scenarios. We can then put those through an impacts model, and here I'm showing a hydrological model, but actually we might use a number of different impacts models as well. And then we look at an impact on some kind of quantity here. Here we're looking at groundwater levels, for example, and you can see that in general, all of those different climate change scenarios show declines, but it really depends on the scenario you choose as to the actual quantity of declining groundwater from this study. And then we can move on again and look at decision making. And a decision-led approach might actually define, for example, what quantity we were interested in. It might even define what impact model we use in terms of whether that impact model is able to reproduce the impact we're interested in terms of decision maker. And it also might tell us something about what climate scenarios we might choose as well, or what downscaling method. So this is a picture I took in 2007. I'm a regular visitor to Boulder, and I would encourage you to really enjoy your time while you're here, and make the most of it. Boulder's a wonderful place. It really is wonderful. This is a picture taken from the top of Green Mountain, which is it's not the mountain above NCAR, it's the next mountain along. You can see here the view over the Rocky Mountains, and actually if you look the other way, you see the view over Boulder. And all those little sort of things there are actually the mountains you can see. The little sort of pyramid-y things are the mountains you can see from the top. So my goals for the workshop are really to learn a lot. I've seen all your CVs, and I know you're really bright people, and I'm hoping to learn a lot from you. I'm hoping to help to educate the next generation. We were talking about this last night, what is the next generation? But basically, the people who are going to be in the sort of positions we're in now in 15 years' time or something, and are still going to be alive in terms of doing something about climate change or still in the system really in 30 years' time or so. So to help educate you in interdisciplinary thinking and integrated approaches to climate change uncertainty. So even if you go back into your own specialism afterwards, which I'm sure you all will, you'll actually start to think in a different way and at least start to understand how you need to communicate and what sort of uncertainties you need to include in your own work to make it useful for exploring some of the big questions in climate change uncertainty. And ultimately helping to move towards climate resilient futures, I think. I'm going to finish there. Thanks very much.